My son backhanded me across the face and screamed that he was the owner of my house now. I wiped the blood from my lip and didn't say a single word. The next morning, I put on my best suit and cooked him a 5-star breakfast. He smiled, thinking he had finally broken me, thinking he had won it all. But that smile vanished the second he saw who else was sitting at our dining room table, waiting for him. Before I tell you how I served my ungrateful son a plate of cold justice, let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you raised, someone you carried on your shoulders, and saw absolutely nothing but greed staring back at you? If you have ever felt the betrayal of your own blood, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you are watching us from. The crack of his hand against my cheekbone sounded like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. The force of the blow made me stumble backward. My lower back hit the edge of the granite island, and my knees buckled. At 74 years old, my bones don't take impacts the way they used to. I slid down the cabinets until I hit the cold tile floor. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. I touched my lip, and my fingers came away stained red. I looked up, and towering over me was James, my son, my only child. The boy I had taught to ride a bike in this exact driveway. The boy I had driven to soccer practice at 5 a.m. for 10 years. Now he was 42, but in that moment he looked like a giant erratic toddler throwing a tantrum. His face was flushed, and a vein bulged in his neck. He was shaking, not from regret, but with a terrifying adrenaline. "Sign the papers, old man," James roared. His voice echoed in the high ceilings of the house I had built 40 years ago. "You're done. You are finished. I am the boss of this house now, and I am the CEO of this company. Mum is dead, and there is no one left to protect you from reality." I just sat there on the floor of my own kitchen, pressing a napkin against my bleeding lip. I didn't try to get up right away. My hip was throbbing with a dull fire, but my mind was surprisingly clear. I looked at him. I really looked at him. I was searching for any trace of the son I loved. I was looking for the young man who used to call me, asking for advice on how to tie a Windsor knot or how to talk to girls. But that man was gone. In his place was a stranger wearing an expensive Italian suit that I had paid for. His eyes were wide and manic. There was no love there. There was only a desperate hunger for power. On the kitchen island right above my head lay a stack of crisp white documents. I knew exactly what they were without reading them. A deed transfer for this property in the most exclusive zip code in the city. A total surrender of my majority shares in Caldwell Logistics. He wanted it all. The trucking empire I had built from a single delivery van in 1975. The home where we had celebrated 40 Christmases. He wanted to strip me of everything. It had only been 3 months since we buried his mother, my Beatrice, my partner of 50 years. The grief was still a raw, open wound in my chest. Every morning I still woke up reaching for her side of the bed, only to find cold sheets. I was still learning how to make coffee for one person. I was vulnerable. I was mourning, and my son saw that, not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. While I was grieving, he had been plotting. I realized it as I sat there, tasting my own blood. He had been waiting for Beatrice to die, because he knew she was the only one who could rein in his worst impulses. She was the only one who could tell him no. with her gone. He figured the gatekeeper was dead and the castle was his for the taking. The irony was suffocating. Those exact papers on the counter, I had actually drafted them myself 6 months ago, not as a surrender, but as a surprise gift for his upcoming birthday. I had planned to gracefully hand him the reins so I could retire and travel with Beatrice, but he hadn't waited. He couldn't wait. He had turned a gift into a weapon, and he was pointing it at my head. I started to pull myself up, using the cabinet handle for leverage. My arms were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice water in my veins. James stepped forward, raising his hand again, as if he were going to strike me a second time. He wanted me to flinch. He wanted to see his father cower. I locked my eyes onto his, and I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let him see that while my body might be old, my spirit was not broken. He hesitated. His hand slowly dropped, but the sneer remained on his face. "You're pathetic," he spit. "Look at you. You can barely stand. You're a liability, Robert. You're going to ruin the company. And you keep holding on. I'm doing this to save your legacy, even if you're too senile to see it." That was the narrative he was building. I saw it now. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He wanted to convince me and everyone else that I was losing my mind, that grief had made me incompetent, that he was the dutiful son stepping in to take the keys away from Grandpa before he hurt himself. But I knew the numbers. I still read the financial reports every morning. I knew that last quarter James had tried to force a merger with a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I had blocked it. I thought it was just a rookie mistake. A lapse in business judgment. Now, looking at the violence in his eyes, I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was a robbery. He wasn't trying to save the company. He was trying to liquidate it. Just then, I heard the click-clack of heels on the hardwood floor. Valerie walked into the kitchen. My daughter-in-law was wearing a silk robe and holding a green smoothie, looking completely unfazed by the violence that had just occurred. She stopped in the doorway and surveyed the scene. Her father-in-law was on the floor, wiping blood from his mouth. Her husband was standing over him, panting like a wild animal. Any decent human being would have rushed to help. Anyone with an ounce of empathy would have been horrified. Valerie simply took a sip of her smoothie and checked her freshly manicured nails. She walked right past me, stepping right over my legs, as if I were a spilled bag of groceries or a piece of furniture that had tipped over. "Babe, you're going to be late for your massage if we don't wrap this up," she told James. Her voice was bored, monotone, like we were discussing what to order for dinner, not the violent assault of an old man. She leaned against the counter, right next to the transfer papers. She looked down at me, her eyes entirely devoid of warmth. "Just sign the papers, Dad. Stop making this so hard on everyone. We found a lovely place for you, Sunny Meadows." It's not the most expensive package, obviously, because we need to be fiscally responsible right now, but it's clean. You'll have a bed and 3 meals a day. It's more than enough for someone your age. Sunny Meadows. I knew that place. It was a state-funded facility 3 towns over. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, a place where people went to stare at walls until they died. The smell of stale urine and boiled cabbage haunted the hallways of that place. They weren't just kicking me out of my house, they were throwing me away. They wanted to erase me from the picture so they could enjoy the view from my balcony without the guilt of looking at me. I looked at Valerie. I remembered paying for her wedding dress, a designer gown that cost more than my first car. I remembered paying off her student loans when she married James, so they could start their life debt-free. I remembered welcoming her into this family, treating her like the daughter I never had. And this was her repayment, a smirk and a one-way ticket to a nursing home. She drummed her long, perfectly sculpted nails against the granite. "Come on, Robert," she sighed. "Don't be selfish. James has worked so hard. He deserves this. You had your time. Now it's our turn." Selfish. The word hung in the air. I had worked 18-hour days for 40 years to build this life. I had missed school plays and anniversaries to secure their future. And now I was the selfish one for not wanting to be tossed in the garbage. James grabbed the pen from the counter and shoved it in my face. The ink tip hovered inches from my nose. "Do it," he growled. "Do it. Or I swear to God, I will have you declared mentally incompetent by noon. I have the doctors lined up. I have the paperwork drafted. If you sign now, you leave with some dignity. If you make me force you, you leave in a straitjacket." My hand was steady as I reached out, but I didn't take the pen. I used the counter to pull myself completely upright. I smoothed down my sweater. I fixed my grey hair. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the bacon grease from the breakfast I had been cooking before my son decided to assault me. I looked at the unsigned papers. Then I looked at the two vultures standing in my kitchen. The kitchen where Beatrice used to hum while she baked cookies. The kitchen that was the beating heart of my world. They stood there, united in their greed, confident in their victory. They saw a bleeding, lonely old man. They didn't see Robert Caldwell. They didn't see the man who had survived recessions, strikes, and corporate raiders. They thought the fight was over. "I need my reading glasses," I said. My voice was raspy but calm. "I can't sign what I can't read." James let out a harsh laugh. He threw his head back, confident in his victory. "Finally," he said. "You're finally showing some common sense. Go get your glasses. You have 5 minutes. Then we're done." I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I walked slowly, dragging my left leg, a little more than usual, playing up the frailty. I heard them high-five behind my back. I heard Valerie laugh and say something about booking a first-class flight to Paris next week. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was going to my room to get my glasses and sign my life away. They were wrong. I was going to my room to get the one thing that could stop them. I wasn't going to get glasses. I was going to get justice. But as I climbed those stairs, every step sending a jolt of pain through my bruised hip, I realized that the man who came back down wouldn't be the same man who went up. Robert the father was dying on these steps. Robert the CEO, the man they called the Iron Shark in the boardrooms back in the 90s, he was waking up. I didn't even make it to the top of the stairs. I felt a heavy hand grab my shoulder, spinning me around hard enough to make my head swim. James hadn't waited for me to get my glasses. His patience, thin as it was, had evaporated the second I turned my back. He shoved me against the hallway wall, the family portraits rattling in their frames from the impact. I tried to protest, to maintain whatever dignity I had scraped together in the kitchen, but he was all over me instantly. His hands were everywhere, invading my personal space with a violation that made my skin crawl. He reached into my sweater pocket and ripped out my smartphone. Then he dug into my slacks, pulling out my leather wallet, the one Beatrice had given me for our 30th anniversary. Finally, he snatched the keys to the classic Mustang from my other pocket. That car was my pride, my freedom. the last thing I had restored with my own hands. "You don't need these anymore, Dad." He sneered, pocketing my life into his jacket. "You're confused. You might lose them. You might hurt yourself. We're handling your affairs now." It was a mugging. There was no other word to describe it. I was being mugged in my own hallway by the son I had sent to private school. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the loose skin of my bicep, and dragged me away from the master bedroom. He pulled me down the hall toward the back of the house, toward the small, cold guest room we used for storage. The room smelled of old cedar and neglect. He shoved me inside with such contempt that I tripped and fell onto the twin mattress. The springs groaned under my weight. Before I could even roll over, the heavy oak door slammed shut. Then came the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The dry, final click of the deadbolt sliding home from the outside. I was a prisoner. For a few minutes I just sat there on the edge of the dusty bed. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. My hip throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. Not the tremor of age, but the tremor of absolute, crushing helplessness. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. I felt the urge to curl into a ball and cry for the life that had been stolen from me in the span of an hour. I was 74 years old. I was supposed to be enjoying my golden years, not locked in a spare room like a rebellious kid. But as I sat there, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, something shifted inside me. The tears stopped before they could fall. The shaking in my hands steadied. The part of my brain that had built a logistics empire out of a single truck started to wake up. I had spent 40 years solving impossible problems. I had navigated recessions, hostile takeovers, and union strikes. I wasn't just a sad old man. I was Robert Caldwell. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Panic is a luxury I cannot afford, I told myself. This isn't a tragedy. This is a business problem, and every problem has a solution. I began to analyze my situation with cold detachment. My assets were compromised. My lines of communication were cut. My physical mobility was limited. My opponent was arrogant, emotional, and underestimating me. That was my biggest advantage. James thought he had locked up a senile father. He didn't realize he had locked up a strategist with absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked around the room, cataloguing everything. A lamp, a heavy brass paperweight on the nightstand, a window that overlooked the side yard, and the closet. The closet where I kept the old junk I couldn't bear to throw away. My eyes narrowed. He had taken my smartphone, but he hadn't tossed the room. He was careless. He was lazy. I stood up, ignoring the pain in my hip. I walked to the door and tested the handle, locked tight. Good. Let him feel secure. Let him think he won. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. I heard him laughing with Valerie. They were celebrating. They were popping champagne. Let them drink, I thought. Let them get drunk on their victory, because tomorrow the bill comes due. I stepped back from the door and looked at the closet. It was time to get to work. I woke up to the sound of a key turning in the lock, but the door didn't open. Morning light filtered through the dusty curtains of the guest room, illuminating floating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. My hip was stiff, a dull ache reminding me of last night's violence before my eyes even fully opened. I sat up, rubbing my face. The stubble on my chin felt rough. I hadn't shaved. I hadn't washed. I felt dirty and old. Then I heard it. The heavy, comforting thud of the front door closing downstairs, followed by the familiar jingle of keys being dropped into the ceramic bowl on the foyer table. Mary. She had been our housekeeper for 20 years. She knew the rhythm of this house better than anyone. She knew I liked my black coffee at 6 a.m. She knew Beatrice always forgot where she put her reading glasses. Mary was an ally. Mary could help me. I got out of bed, ignoring the protest of my joints. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the cold wood. I needed to get her attention. I raised my fist to knock on the panel, to scream her name, to demand she let me out. But before my knuckles could graze the wood, I heard James's voice. It was loud, projected clearly up the stairwell, unnatural in its volume. He wasn't just talking to Mary, he was performing. "Mary, please don't go upstairs this morning," James said. His tone was drenched in a fake, sickeningly sweet concern that made my stomach turn. "We're having a bit of a crisis with Dad." I heard Mary's soft, accented voice, thick with worry. "Is Mr. Robert okay? I didn't see him in the kitchen. He usually beats the sun up." "He's not okay, Mary." James sighed a theatrical exhale that he surely accompanied with a shake of his head. Since Mom passed, his mind just broke. The dementia set in really fast. He's aggressive. Last night he had an episode. He got violent, started screaming about people stealing his company. He actually smashed his own face into the wall. There was blood everywhere. I froze. My fist hovered inches from the door, trembling with impotent rage. He was using my injury, the wound he inflicted, as proof of my insanity. He was twisting the truth so effectively that even the physical evidence would work against me. I had to lock him in the guest room for his own safety. James continued, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that I could still hear perfectly. "He tries to escape. He tries to hurt himself. It breaks my heart to do it, but the doctor said we have to be strict until the medication kicks in. So if you hear him screaming or banging on the door, please just ignore it. It's just the disease talking. It's not him anymore." "Oh, poor thing," Mary whispered. I could hear the tears in her voice. The poor man. Losing his wife and then his mind is a tragedy. A scream formed in my throat, a primal roar of denial. I wanted to beat that door down. I wanted to scream that he was a liar, a thief, a monster. My muscles tensed, ready to unleash hell. I drew in a breath to yell Mary's name, and then I stopped. The air left my lungs in a silent exhale. I lowered my hand. If I screamed right now, what would Mary hear? Would she hear her employer of 20 years crying for help? Or would she hear the raving lunatic James had just described? If I pounded on the door, would she see a prisoner trying to escape, or a confused old man having a violent episode? James had set a trap, a brilliant, evil trap. Any attempt to defend myself would only validate his lie. The rage would look like dementia. The desperation would look like instability. He had weaponized my own voice against me. I stepped back from the door, careful not to let the floorboards creak. I stood in the center of the room, my hands balled into fists at my sides. I let the silence wrap around me. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a sound. I wouldn't be a prop in his play. If he wanted everyone to think I was crazy, let him try to prove it when I was calm, collected, and colder than the grave. I heard Mary walking toward the kitchen, murmuring prayers for my lost soul. I'm not lost, Mary, I thought. I'm just waiting. And silence was the first move in a game James didn't even know we were playing. I didn't have to wait long for the next act of his betrayal to begin. Heavy footsteps returned, stopping right outside the door in the hallway that served as an acoustic bridge to the study below. I pressed my ear against the narrow gap between the door frame and the wood, straining to catch every syllable. The sound of a number being dialed echoed in the quiet, followed by a throat clearing I knew all too well. It was the sound James made right before he told a lie. "Gentlemen, thank you for jumping on the call on such short notice," James said, dropping his voice an octave into a register of practiced solemnity. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding the chairman." I held my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He was calling the board of directors. He was talking to the men and women I had worked with for 30 years. "Yes, Jonathan. It happened last night," James continued. "A mini stroke. Doctors call it a transient ischemic attack, but combined with the grief over Mum's passing, it accelerated his cognitive decline significantly. He's confused. He's combative. To be honest, he doesn't even know what year it is." The lie was so smooth, so effortless that for a second I almost checked my own pulse. He was burying me alive professionally. He was painting a picture of a drooling invalid, completely incapable of tying his own shoes, let alone running a Fortune 500 logistics company. I wanted to scream that I was right here behind this door, sharper than he would ever be. But I remembered the trap. Any noise would just be the soundtrack to his story. I understand James said cutting off whatever condolences were being offered on the other end. We're all devastated, but the business has to continue. Dad would want us to be decisive. That's why I'm stepping in as interim CEO, effective immediately. And my first act of executive order is the restructuring plan we discussed. Restructuring. In the corporate world, that's a polite word for a massacre. My stomach twisted. "Yes, exactly, James," said his voice hardening. "I want to liquidate the Midwest Distribution Center, the land, the warehouses, the fleet. We have a buyer lined up, private equity. They're offering cash, fast cash. We can close by Friday if we push the paperwork through today." My knees gave out, and I slid down the door until I hit the floor. The Midwest Distribution Center. That wasn't just an asset that was the crown jewel of Corbar Logistics. It was the first major expansion I made back in '85. It employed 200 loyal workers. It was the beating heart of our entire operation. Selling it would be like ripping the engine out of a race car just to sell it for scrap. And the capital fleet, James added. Sell the trucks. We'll outsource the shipping to third-party contractors. Cut our overhead by 40%. He wasn't trying to run the company, he was gutting it. He was stripping the copper out of the walls. He was dismantling 40 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifice just to get his hands on a quick influx of liquid cash. Why did he need so much money so fast? You don't liquidate your core assets unless you're desperate, or unless you're planning to take the money and run. I listened as he wrapped up the call, promising to send the digital signatures over within the hour. Signatures he fully intended to force out of me or forge. He hung up, and I heard him exhale a long, shaky breath, followed by a low, manic laugh. "He's going to kill it," I whispered to the empty room. He's going to kill my company. The realization hit me harder than his backhand had the night before. This wasn't just about power or the house. This was a fire sale. James was burning my legacy down just to warm his hands. I sat there on the dusty floorboards, and I felt the cold clarity of the businessman completely take over. He had declared war on my life's work, and he had just made a fatal tactical error. He assumed the company was just assets and numbers. He forgot the company was people, and those people were loyal to me. I looked over at the closet where the old phone was hidden. He wanted to sell the Midwest Distribution Center by Friday. That meant I had less than 48 hours to stop him. The waiting was over. It was time to make a call. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving my prison in deep shadow. My stomach growled with a low rumble of protest that echoed in the silence. I hadn't eaten since the toast I made myself before yesterday's assault. The hunger was a sharp cramp in my gut, but it was nothing compared to the thirst. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton and sand. I sat on the edge of the mattress waiting. I knew they would come eventually, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. They needed me alive and somewhat functional for the signatures. Dead men can't sign a power of attorney. Finally, around 9 p.m., the heavy deadbolt slid back with a metallic screech. The door creaked open, cutting a wedge of hallway light into the room. Valerie stood there silhouetted against the glare. She was holding a plastic tray in her hands. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the aroma of a fresh dinner. It was the stale stench of old garlic and cold grease. She walked in, leaving the door open just enough for me to see James pacing down the hall, without even glancing inside. He couldn't even look at me, the coward. Valerie kicked the door shut with her heel and dropped the tray onto the small, wobbly nightstand. I looked at the food, a bowl of pasta that had clearly been congealing in the fridge for days, the sauce separated into oily orange puddles, a single slice of dry bread, and a small plastic cup of water. Next to the water sat 2 small blue pills. "Dinner is served, Robert," she said, her voice dripping with a fake cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. "You need to eat. James is worried you're starving yourself for attention." "Attention?" I looked at her. She was dressed for bed in silk pajamas that probably cost more than all the furniture in this room. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, but her expression was uglier than I had ever seen it. The mask was entirely gone. She looked at me not with pity, not even with anger, but with pure, unadulterated disgust. To her, I wasn't a person anymore. I was an obstacle, a stubborn stain on her perfect life that refused to wash out. I reached for the water, my hand shaking. This time I didn't have to fake the tremor entirely. Dehydration does weird things to the body. "What is this?" I rasped, pointing at the pills. "It's just something to help you sleep," she said, crossing her arms. Her eyes narrowed, reptilian and cold. "The doctor said you're agitated. This will calm you down. It's for your own good." I knew exactly what it was. It wasn't aspirin, it wasn't a vitamin, it was a chemical leash. They wanted me sedated, docile and confused. They wanted the lie of dementia to become a chemical reality. If I was high, I might sign anything just to make the room stop spinning. I looked at the pills, then up at her. I saw the impatience twitching in her jaw. She wanted to be back in her master suite, probably watching reality TV and drinking wine. She resented every second she had to spend in this airless room with the old man. "Do I have to take them now?" I asked, making my voice sound thin and broken. Yes, right now, she snapped. I'm not leaving until you do. I'm not letting you flush them down the toilet and then stay up all night screaming. Swallow them. I knew I had to sell the performance of a lifetime. I let my shoulders slump. I let my head hang as if the weight of my defeat was simply too much to bear. I picked up the pills, my fingers clumsy and fumbling. I dropped one on the blanket. Then I scrambled to pick it up, perfectly playing the part of the fading old man. I saw her roll her eyes. She was tapping her foot, a steady rhythm of irritation. Oh, for God's sake, just take them, Robert. I popped the pills into my mouth, but I didn't swallow. With a sleight of hand I hadn't used since hiding chewing tobacco from my high school principal. 50 years ago, I slid the small tablets under my tongue, pressing them hard against the soft tissue of the floor of my mouth. I grabbed the cup of water and took a huge gulp, swishing it around to mimic the act of swallowing before letting the water slide down my throat. I opened my mouth and lifted my tongue, showing her the empty surface. It was a humiliating gesture, something a child does for a strict nurse, but it was necessary. Good, she said, her face relaxing into a smirk of triumph. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Now eat your dinner. We have a big day tomorrow. She didn't ask if I was in pain. She didn't ask if I needed an extra blanket. She just turned on her heel and walked out. The door slammed. The lock clicked. I was alone again. I waited 5 seconds, 10. Then I leaned over the side of the bed and spit the bitter, dissolving paste into my palm. I wiped my tongue on my shirt sleeve, trying to get rid of the chemical taste. I looked at the blue paste in my hand. Heavy sedatives enough to knock out a horse or turn an old man into a zombie for 12 hours. I wrapped the crushed remains in a tissue from my pocket and shoved it deep into the toe of an old winter boot in the closet. I walked back to the bed and stared at the cold pasta. I ate it, every bite. It was disgusting, but I needed the calories. I needed the energy. Because tonight, while they slept thinking I was drugged into oblivion, I had work to do. They thought they had sedated the monster. They had only fed it. 2 a.m., the witching hour. The house was settled into a deep rhythmic silence, broken only by the occasional settling groan of the wooden beams I had paid for 30 years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed. In the pitch black, my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The sedatives were safely hidden in the toe of a boot in the closet, and my mind was sharp as a razor honed on the whetstone of betrayal. They had taken my keys, they had taken my phone, they had taken my wallet, but they had made the classic mistake of the arrogant. They assumed my power came from the objects I owned, not the skills I possessed. They looked at an old man in a sweater. They forgot that before I was a CEO, before I was chairman, I was a mechanic. I spent the first decade of my adult life covered in grease, coaxing life out of dead engines and unlocking seized gears with nothing but patience and a piece of wire. I reached into my slacks and pulled out the old pair of reading glasses I had retrieved from the closet earlier. They were cheap pharmacy frames, scratched and bent, forgotten in a coat pocket years ago. I didn't need the lenses, I needed the metal. With a steady pressure that made my arthritic thumbs ache, I snapped the left arm off the frame. I stripped the plastic coating away with my fingernails until I was left with a thin, tough piece of wire. I bent the tip into a slight hook, testing the tension against my thumb. It wasn't a professional tension wrench, but for a simple interior privacy lock on a guest room door, it was more than enough. I moved to the door, silent as a shadow. I knelt on the cold floorboards, my knees protesting the hard contact, and inserted the makeshift pick into the keyhole. I closed my eyes, visualizing the pins inside the brass mechanism. It was all about touch. The first pin set. Click. I applied a little more torque. The second pin resisted, sticky with age and lack of oil. I coaxed it gently, feeling the vibration travel up the wire to my fingers. Click. The lock turned. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I turned the knob slowly, millimetre by millimetre, terrified the latch would snap back with a loud crack. It slid open with a soft, oily whisper. I pushed the door open just enough to slip through. The hallway was a cavern of shadows. I took off my socks. Shoes would be too loud on the hardwood, and socks could slip. Bare feet were quieter. I needed to feel the floor, to know exactly where to put my weight, to avoid the creaks I knew by heart. The floor was freezing, biting into the soles of my feet, grounding me in the reality of what I was doing. I was prowling through the house I built like a thief in the night. I crept past the master bedroom. I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of snoring. James, sleeping. The sleep of the victorious. He thought he had won. He thought the game was over. He didn't know the second half had just started. I moved down the stairs, hugging the wall, where the supports were strongest and the wood least likely to groan. The house felt alien in the dark. The familiar shapes of furniture transformed into menacing obstacles. I reached the bottom floor and turned toward my study. The door was cracked open. A faint, pulsing blue light spilled onto the Persian rug. He hadn't even turned the computer off. I slipped inside the study. The air smelled of his cologne, a cloying, expensive scent that masked the smell of my old leather books. I walked around the heavy oak desk, my desk, and looked at the screen. The computer was in sleep mode. I tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, blindingly bright in the pitch black. I squinted, my heart stopping in my chest. He hadn't just left it on. He had left it logged in. He was so confident in my incompetence, so sure I was locked up and drugged, that he hadn't even bothered with basic security. On the screen was a spreadsheet. It was complex, a maze of columns and numbers that would have baffled a layman. But I wasn't a layman. I had been reading ledgers since before James was born. I leaned in, my nose inches from the screen, dissecting the data. My eyes went wide. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a restructuring plan. It wasn't just an asset sale. It was a digitized crime scene in Excel. I traced the rows. There were wire transfers, massive, irregular wire transfers siphoned out of the operating accounts into a shell corporation I didn't recognize. JC Investments, James Caldwell Investments. Subtlety wasn't his strong suit. But then I saw the source of the funds. My stomach dropped like the floor had vanished beneath me. He wasn't just skimming profits. He wasn't just selling trucks. Employee pension fund. The numbers screamed at me in black and white. Millions of dollars. He had drained $3 million from the retirement accounts of my drivers, my mechanics, the people who had given me 30 years of their lives. Men and women who trusted me to secure their future were being robbed blind by my own son, so he could cover what I scrolled down. I found a minimized folder on the taskbar labeled Crypto. I opened it. It was a bloodbath, trade logs showing massive, catastrophic losses. He had been gambling. He had taken honest workers' savings and thrown them into a digital fire, trying to get rich quick, trying to be the big man he never was. He wasn't selling the company to save it. He was selling it to cover a $3 million hole before the auditors arrived next month. He was going to gut the company, take the cash from the asset sale, plug the hole in the pension fund just long enough to pass an audit, and then disappear with whatever was left, leaving behind an empty shell. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so tight my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just greed anymore. This was evil. He was willing to destroy hundreds of families to save his own skin. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small thumb drive I had taken from the shoebox upstairs. My hands were shaking, but I forced them steady. I plugged it into the side of the monitor. I copied the spreadsheet, I copied the trade logs, I copied the emails open in the background discussing the expedited liquidation. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Green, steady, relentless. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on." The computer chimed softly. "Transfer complete." I yanked the drive out and shoved it deep into my pocket. It felt heavy, like it held the weight of the world. I looked at the screen one last time, the evidence of my son's moral rot. Then carefully I put the computer back to sleep. I turned to leave, but a sound stopped me dead. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Then another. Footsteps. Someone was awake. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I stood in the dark study, a ghost in my own home, clutching the evidence that would send my son to prison, and waited to see if the monster was coming down to feed. I remained frozen in the shadows of the hallway, my bare feet numb against the floorboards. The footsteps I'd heard weren't coming down the stairs. They were pacing back and forth in the master bedroom. My bedroom, the sanctuary I had shared with Beatrice for 40 years. The voices were muffled at first, but as I crept closer, hugging the wall like a spectre in my own house, the words became razor sharp. I reached the landing. The door to the master suite was cracked open just an inch, spilling a slice of golden light across the carpet. I shouldn't have looked. A father should never have to see his son in a moment of such raw, unfiltered villainy. But I leaned in. My eye pressed to the gap, driven by a morbid need to know the absolute depth of the pit they had dug for me. James was pacing, wearing nothing but his boxers, his body glistening with nervous sweat. He looked manic, his eyes darting around the room as if the walls were closing in on him. Valerie was lounging on the bed. My bed, propped up against the pillows I had bought for Beatrice's bad back. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was staring at her phone, a soft, cruel smile playing on her lips. I watched her tap the screen, her thumbs flying with practiced speed. Then she brought the phone to her lips, holding down the record button. I held my breath. "Just a few more days, babe," she whispered. Her voice husky and intimate, but not directed at the man pacing in front of her. The idiot is losing his grip, but he's doing exactly what we need. He's liquidating the assets. Once the cash hits the offshore account, I'm leaving him to deal with the fallout. Got the tickets to Paris? Wait for me at the hotel. Love you, Jean-Luc. She released the button and sent the message, dropping the phone onto the duvet with a satisfied sigh. My stomach churned. She wasn't just a gold digger, she was a parasite, feeding on a host she was already planning to abandon. She was texting her lover right there, lying in the bed, paid for by the husband she was conning, while planning to run off with the fortune he was stealing from me. It was a layer of betrayal so thick, it was almost impressive in its depravity. James stopped pacing. He ran a hand through his hair, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had just signed his emotional death warrant. He was too focused on signing my physical one. "He's not going to sign Valerie," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. I saw it in his eyes today, the stubborn old bastard. He's going to drag this out until the auditors get here. Valerie yawned, picking at a loose thread on the comforter. "So make him sign, James. You're the man of the house now, right? Stop whining and handle it." I watched James's face shift. The anxiety hardened into something jagged and dark. He walked over to the dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer. He pulled out a small black case. I recognized it. It was my old diabetes kit from before I managed to control my sugar with my diet. There was insulin in there. Expired, unstable, dangerous. "You're right," he said softly, staring at the vial in his hand. "I'm done asking. I'm done waiting for him to die of natural causes." He turned to face Valerie, holding the vial up to the light. "Tomorrow morning, if he hesitates for even a second, I'll give him a little help," he said. "A high dose. Not enough to kill him. That would trigger an autopsy. Just enough to induce a severe hypoglycemic event. Scramble his brain. He'll slip into a coma. Maybe wake up with significant brain damage. He'll be a vegetable." Valerie looked up, interest finally sparking in her eyes. "Can you do that?" "Easy," James replied, a chilling smile spreading across his face. "He's old. He's grieving. Who's going to question a medical emergency? Once he's incapacitated, I get emergency power of attorney by default. He becomes a vegetable, and I get a rubber stamp. I can sign whatever I want, and he'll just sit there and drool." I backed away from the door, my entire body turning to stone. I didn't feel the cold floor anymore. I didn't feel the ache in my hip, the sting of betrayal, the grief for my wife, the pity for my son. It all evaporated. It was burned away by a white-hot clarity. He wasn't just a thief. He wasn't just a disappointment. He was an executioner. He planned to lobotomize his own father to cover his gambling debts. I turned and walked back to the guest room. I didn't tiptoe. I didn't skulk. I walked with the heavy, measured tread of a predator that has decided to stop stalking and start hunting. I slipped back into the room and locked the door from the inside, but I didn't go back to bed. I stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit lawn. Robert the father died in that hallway. He died the moment he heard his son plot to turn him into a vegetable. The man standing by the window wasn't a father. He was the man who had crushed his competitors without mercy in the 80s. He was the man who had fired his own brother for skimming from the company till, in '95, he was the shark. I touched the flash drive in my pocket. I touched the burner phone. "You want a vegetable, James?" I whispered to the glass, my reflection staring back at me with flinty eyes. "I'll give you a vegetable, but it won't be me." I checked my watch. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours to set the stage for the final act. I pulled off my cardigan and tossed it in the corner. I rolled up my sleeves. It was time to get to work. The shark was hungry, and breakfast would be served very soon. I knelt on the floorboards beside the narrow guest bed, ignoring the sharp protest of my arthritic knees. I reached my arm deep into the darkness under the frame, pushing past moth-eaten blankets and boxes of old tax returns that smelled of mildew. My fingers brushed against dust bunnies and cobwebs until they finally made contact with the cold, smooth surface of a late 90s shoebox. I dragged it out into the pale moonlight filtering through the window. It was unremarkable, battered and sealed shut with yellowing tape. To anyone else, it looked like garbage. To James, it had looked like just another piece of the old man's hoarding, a sad collection of sentimental junk, not worth his precious time to investigate during his raid on my pockets. That arrogance was his fatal flaw. He only valued things that shined. He never understood that the most dangerous things are often the most unassuming. I peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of old tissue paper, lay two objects. The first was a matte black .38 caliber snub-nose revolver. It was heavy, cold, and lethal. I hadn't fired it in 20 years, not since an attempted robbery at the old warehouse back in '98. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm. The metal was smooth against my skin. It would be so easy. I could walk right up those stairs right now. I could kick open the door to the master bedroom. I could end the threat to my life with a single squeeze of the trigger. It would even be self-defense. He had threatened to kill me. He planned to turn me into a vegetable. No jury in the world would convict a terrified old man defending himself against a son who had already drawn blood. I stared at the gun, visualizing the scene, the noise, the mess, the finality of it all. For a moment, the temptation was a physical, almost magnetic pull. But then I shook my head. No, a bullet was too fast. A bullet was mercy. James didn't deserve the quick exit of a tragedy. He deserved the slow, agonizing dismantling of a bankruptcy. I wanted him to live. I wanted him to live long enough to see everything he coveted stripped away, layer by layer, until he was left naked and shivering in the ruins of his own greed. I placed the gun back into the box, pushing it aside. I didn't need lead to kill him. I had something much more powerful. I reached for the second object. A Nokia 3310. A brick. A relic from a time when things were built to last. It was scratched and the screen was tiny and monochrome, but to me it looked more beautiful than the newest smartphone. James had laughed at this phone years ago when he found it in a drawer. He called it a dinosaur. He asked why I kept such garbage. I kept it because unlike the fragile glass wafers he was addicted to, this phone could survive a nuclear winter. And most importantly, it was untraceable. I popped the back cover off with my thumbnail. Inside, taped to the battery, was a simple prepaid SIM card that got swapped out every 6 months just for Protocol Omega. I'd bought it with cash at a convenience store 3 towns away. No name attached, no contract, no paper trail. I slid the SIM card into the slot, my fingers moving with a precision that defied my age. I snapped the battery back in and pressed the power button. For one agonizing second, the screen remained dark. I held my breath, praying the charge I had checked 3 months ago had held. Then the screen flickered. A soft green glow illuminated my face in the dark. The Nokia Shaking Hands logo appeared. The battery indicator showed 3 bars. I let out a shaky sigh of relief. It was alive. I was back on the grid. James had taken my smartphone, thinking he had cut out my tongue. He thought he had isolated me from my allies, from my lawyers, from the world. He didn't realize that I didn't need the internet. I didn't need apps. I didn't need social media. I just needed a signal. I watched the signal bars pop up one by one. 1 bar, 2 bars, full signal. I held the phone in my hand, feeling its solid weight. This plastic brick was my command center. It was my sword and my shield. With this, I could freeze accounts. With this, I could summon the cavalry. With this, I could drop the full weight of the federal government on my son's head before he even finished his morning coffee. I sat there in the dark, the green light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I wasn't just an old man in a guest room anymore. I was a general in his bunker. The time for hiding was over. The time for planning was done. Now it was time to execute. I dialed Chloe's number from memory, my thumb dancing over the rubber keypad. It was time to wake her up. It was time to wake everyone up. The shark was back in the water, and the water was about to turn red. I pressed the green call button and held the cold plastic to my ear. The line hissed with the static of a connection bridging across the sleeping city. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I didn't hang up. I knew Chloe. She slept with her phone on the nightstand, and she had been my personal attorney for 30 years because she possessed the instincts of a viper and the loyalty of a saint. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. "Hello," a voice mumbled, thick with sleep and confusion. "Who is this at 4 a.m.? "Chloe," I said. My voice was low, a gravelly whisper that cut right through the static. "It's Robert. Initiate Protocol Omega." There was a pause. A silence so profound I could almost hear her heart stop on the other end of the line. I heard the rustle of sheets, the sound of someone sitting up violently in bed. "Robert," she breathed, and the sleep was instantly gone from her voice, replaced by a sharp, terrifying clarity. "Oh my God. James called the partners yesterday. You said you had a stroke. He said you were unresponsive. I was going to file an injunction this morning, but he has medical POA. Robert, are you safe?" I looked around the dark, dusty guest room that had become my cell. I looked at the door locked from the outside. I thought about the insulin in the master bedroom and the plans to turn my brain to mush. "I'm still alive, Chloe," I said, my voice firm and cold, like the steel of the gun I'd left in the box. "But I'm being hunted inside my own house." I heard her gasp, a sharp intake of breath. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe, because I am very short on time, and I am only going to say this once," I continued. "James has compromised the company. He is liquidating assets to cover a $3 million embezzlement from the pension fund. I have the evidence on a drive in my pocket. He is planning to induce a medical coma this morning to secure permanent control. This is not a drill. This is a hostile takeover and attempted murder." "Okay," she said, and I could hear the sound of her feet hitting the floor, the click of a lamp turning on. "I'm calling the police right now. I'll have a cruiser there in 10 minutes. "No," I snapped. "No police yet. Not like this. If you send a cruiser now, he'll claim I'm having a dementia episode." He's set the stage perfectly. He'll show them the forged medical docs. He'll say I'm confused and violent. We need to catch him in the act. We need to catch him when he feels completely safe. I took a breath, visualizing the timeline in my head like a military operation. Here is what's going to happen, I said. Call Agent Morales at the FBI. Tell him the Iron Shark has the bait. Tell him I have the ledger. He's been trying to nail the crypto money laundering ring James got mixed up with for months. This is his smoking gun. I looked at my watch. 4:15. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Chloe, I want you to freeze everything. The corporate accounts, the personal trust, the offshore transfers James queued up. Everything. Kill the system. I want his credit cards declined. I want his passcodes to fail. I want him to watch his digital world collapse right when he thinks he's crossing the finish line. But Robert, Chloe interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. That's dangerous. If he realizes the accounts are frozen and he's in the house with you, he might panic. He might hurt you. Let him panic, I said, feeling a grim smile pull at the corner of my bruised lip. Panic makes people sloppy, and he won't hurt me because he thinks he's already won. And then I continued. I want you to come here. You, Morales, and the local PD. I want you pulling into the driveway at exactly 8:15, not 8:10, not 8:14, 8:15. Why 8:15? She asked, typing furiously on what I assumed was a notepad. Because breakfast is at 7, I said. I'm going to cook him a meal, Chloe. I'm going to serve him pancakes and bacon. I'm going to let him sit at my table and gloat. I want him full. I want him comfortable. I want him to look me in the eye and think he's the king of the world for 1 hour. And then at 8:15, when the doorbell rings, I want to watch his face when the kingdom crumbles. There was a silence on the line again. Then Chloe spoke, and her voice was filled with a mix of awe and fear. You're enjoying this, she whispered. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The bruised old man was gone. He raised his hand to me, Chloe, I said softly. He struck his father. Today he learns that you do not strike the king unless you know exactly how to kill him. Understood, she said, her tone snapping back to professional steel. Freeze accounts at 0800 hours. Contact Agent Morales at the FBI immediately. Arrival at the residence at 08:15 with law enforcement. Robert, please be careful. He is desperate. I'm not the one who needs to be careful, I replied. I hung up the phone and popped the battery out just to be safe. I placed the phone back in the shoebox and slid it under the bed. The connection was made. The fuse was lit. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. I stood up and stretched my stiff limbs. The ache in my hip was still there, but it felt distant now. Irrelevant. I had a schedule to keep. I had a suit to put on. I had a breakfast to cook. I walked to the closet and pulled the overhead light cord. It cast a harsh yellow glow over the room. I looked at the garment bag hanging in the back. My charcoal grey three-piece suit. My armour. I unzipped the bag, and the smell of dry cleaning and expensive wool drifted out. It was the scent of power. It was time to suit up. It was time to go to work. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room closet. The man staring back at me was no longer the grieving widower who had been shoved to the floor. The charcoal grey wool of my three-piece suit hugged my shoulders with the familiar weight of authority. It was a suit I hadn't worn since the board meeting where I fought off a hostile takeover in 2008. It was armour. I buttoned the vest, making sure the line was straight. I tightened the silk tie at my throat until it felt like a second skin. I reached for the small tube of concealer I had taken from Beatrice's vanity months ago, unable to throw it away. I dabbed the beige cream over the purple swelling on my cheekbone. It didn't make the bruise disappear, but it transformed it. It no longer looked like an injury inflicted by a bully. It looked like a battle scar worn by a general who had survived the first volley. I combed my silver hair back severe and precise. I looked into my own eyes. They were cold. They were ready. 5:30 in the morning. The house was silent, a tomb waiting to be disturbed. I opened the door and stepped out. The floorboards didn't creak. This time I walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who owns the ground beneath his feet. I walked down the stairs, my hand gliding over the banister. I had paid for the wood. I had chosen the life I built. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the lights. The fluorescent hum was a call to action. I didn't rush, I didn't flail. I moved with the efficiency of an assembly line. I pulled the heavy cast-iron skillets from the rack. I took the thick-cut bacon from the fridge. I cracked eggs with one hand, the shells splitting cleanly, the yolks dropping into the bowl like golden suns. I started to cook. Not a simple meal, but a feast, a performance. I whisked the hollandaise sauce for the eggs Benedict, watching the butter emulsify into a rich yellow cream. It was a delicate process, one that required patience and control. 2 things James lacked. 2 things I had in abundance. I laid the bacon in the pan and listened to the aggressive sizzle the fat rendering, filling the air with an aroma that was primal and comforting. I mixed the pancake batter, folding the flour in gently. I wanted them fluffy. I wanted them perfect. I wanted this house to smell like a sanctuary. I wanted the scent of maple syrup and cured meat to float up the vents and slip right under the master bedroom door. I wanted to wake them up, not with a shout, but with a seduction. They would smell this and think I had broken. They would think I was trying to buy their kindness with servitude. They would think I was the beaten dog bringing a dead bird to its master's feet, hoping for a pat on the head. Let them think that. Let them salivate. Let them come down here expecting a coronation feast. I plated the food. Stacks of golden pancakes, poached eggs trembling on toasted muffins smothered in velvety sauce, crispy strips of bacon piled high. I carried the platters to the formal dining room. I set the table with the fine china and the silver that Beatrice polished every Thanksgiving. I set out the crystal glasses. I folded the napkins. And then I placed the stack of transfer documents at the head of the table, exactly where James would sit. I took his gold fountain pen and laid it parallel to the document. Perfect alignment. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat down at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I checked my watch. 6:45. I took a sip. The coffee was bitter hot and strong. I crossed my legs, smoothing the crease of my slacks. I wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. I wasn't locking myself in a room. I was sitting in the light, waiting for the rats to come out for the cheese. When they walked through those doors, they wouldn't find a victim. They would find the chairman of the board. And the meeting was about to begin. 7 o'clock arrived with the punctuality of an executioner. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs, followed by the murmur of voices. They were awake. The smell of bacon and caramelized sugar had done its job, acting as a siren song to their greed. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes locked on the double doors of the dining room, waiting for the guests of honour to arrive at their own funeral. The doors swung open. James walked in first. He was wearing my navy blue silk robe, the one Beatrice bought me in Milan. It was too big for him, hanging off his shoulders like a kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. Valerie followed right behind him, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, looking like a cat that had just woken up from a nap in a sunbeam. They stopped dead in their tracks. Their eyes went wide. They stared at the table, loaded with golden stacks of pancakes, steaming eggs Benedict, crystal pitchers of juice. Then they looked at me, sitting at the far end in my charcoal suit. Immaculate and calm. For a split second I saw a flash of confusion, maybe even fear. It was the natural reaction to seeing the victim you just beat down suddenly looking like the master of the house again. But the fear didn't last. It was quickly replaced by a smug, oily satisfaction. James ran a hand through his messy hair and let out a low whistle. He walked toward the table, his eyes locked on the food. "Well, look at this," he said, a smirk twisting his face. He picked up a piece of crispy bacon from the platter and bit into it loud and wet. "Guess you can teach an old dog new tricks after all. Knew you'd come to your senses, Dad." Hunger and a locked door have a way of clearing things up, don't they? He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, my chair. He sat down with a heavy sigh of entitlement, spreading his legs and leaning back, acting like he had built this house himself. He picked up the gold fountain pen I'd placed next to the papers, twirled it between his fingers, and dropped it carelessly onto the tablecloth. "Finally understand your place," James sneered, reaching for the syrup pitcher. "Eat up, everyone, and since you're being so cooperative, I'll tell you what. Once you sign these papers and finish cleaning the kitchen, I'll let you take your favourite pillow with you to Sunny Meadows. Most residents only get the standard foam, but I'll make an exception for you. Consider it a parting gift." Valerie giggled, sliding into the chair next to him. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were glued to the eggs Benedict. "This is really impressive, Robert," she said, grabbing a fork. "I didn't know you could cook like this. If you had made yourself this useful earlier, maybe we wouldn't have had to be so hard on you. But I guess it's too late for that now." I didn't watch them. James stabbed a stack of pancakes with his fork, shoving a massive bite into his mouth. Syrup dripped down his chin. He ate with the frenzied gluttony of a starving animal, chewing with his mouth open, oblivious to everything but his own appetite. He looked disgusting. He looked weak. He looked exactly like what he was, a parasite gorging on a host it thought was dead. I didn't say a word. I just watched. I watched the man who shared my blood shove food into his face while mocking the father who gave him life. I watched him dirty my fine china. I watched him laugh with his mouth full. "Enjoy it, son," I thought. "Enjoy the sweetness of the syrup and the salt of the bacon. Taste the victory. Because in exactly 1 hour, that taste is going to turn to ash in your mouth." I stood up from my chair at the end of the table and picked up the heavy silver coffee pot. It was antique sterling silver, a wedding gift from Beatrice's parents 50 years ago. It had weight. It had dignity. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, where my son was wiping grease off his chin with a linen napkin. The rug absorbed the sound of my footsteps, but the air in the room seemed to thicken with every step I took. I stopped, right next to him. He didn't look up. He just tapped his empty cup with his fingernail, a silent command for me to fill it. A servant. That's what he saw. A broken old servant who existed solely to facilitate his comfort. I lifted the coffee pot, the spout hovering over the delicate china cup. I tilted my wrist. The dark, steaming liquid flowed in a perfect obsidian stream. My hand didn't shake. There was no tremor of age, no shiver of fear. It was as steady as the hand of a surgeon about to make the first incision. "You should savor that bacon, son," I said, my voice low and smooth as velvet over gravel. "Really taste it. Let the maple syrup coat your tongue. Close your eyes and remember the texture of the eggs." James let out a short, barking laugh around a mouthful of food. Yeah, it's good, Dad. You're a regular Gordon Ramsay. Now just pour the coffee and sit down. We have work to do. I didn't sit down. I kept pouring until the coffee was dangerously close to the brim of the cup. The steam rose, curling around his face. I leaned in just close enough to smell the stale alcohol sweating from his pores beneath the scent of my expensive cologne he had stolen. "I mean it, James," I continued, my tone dropping into a register that lacked any warmth whatsoever. "You need to eat slowly. You need to memorize this flavor, because where you're going, the menu is very different. This is the last decent meal you're going to eat for the next 20 years. The fork in James's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. The chewing slowed and then ceased entirely. The silence that fell over the room was instant and suffocating. It was the silence of a predator stepping into a clearing. He swallowed the lump of food with difficulty and turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for the sign of the dementia he had invented, looking for the weakness he was banking on. But he found nothing. He found only the steel gaze of the father who had built a dynasty on grit and diesel fumes. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quiet, uncertain. I set the silver coffee pot down on a trivet with a loud metallic clink. I rested my hand on the back of his chair, looming over him. "I said enjoy it," I repeated clearly. "Prison food is notoriously bland, James, and federal prison, while better than state, still doesn't serve Eggs Benedict on fine china." Valerie dropped her knife. It hit her plate with a harsh screech. She stared at me, the colour draining from her face. Her eyes darted from me to James, then back to me, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure before he did. "Robert, what are you talking about?" she stammered, a nervous laugh bubbling up in her throat. "You're having an episode again. James, get his pills. He's talking nonsense." "I'm not talking nonsense, Valerie," I said, turning my gaze to her. "And I never took your pills, just like I never signed those papers, and just like I never had a stroke." James shoved his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He stood up, trying to regain the height advantage, trying to reassert his dominance. "Sit down, old man," he growled, though his voice wavered slightly. "You're confusing me with your crazy talk. I am the CEO. I am the one in charge." "Are you?" I asked calmly. "Because a real CEO doesn't steal $3 million from his own employees' pension fund to cover crypto gambling losses." James froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he might pass out. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the primal terror of a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, but on a scale that carried a 20-year sentence. "I know about JC Investments, James," I said, relentlessly driving the nail in. I know about the wire transfers. I know you're trying to liquidate the Midwest Center today because the auditors are coming on Monday and you're short $3 million. I know everything. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. How do you know that? I tapped the side of my head. Because I am the shark, and you are just a minnow that swam into deep water. I turned to Valerie, who was now shaking so badly her water glass trembled in her hand. And you, my dear, I said, I hope you enjoyed that text you sent last night, but I have bad news. Jean-Luc isn't going to wait for you. He's not going to Paris with a woman who has no money. Because as of 8 o'clock this morning, all corporate and personal accounts have been frozen. You are broke, both of you. The air in the room was electric charged with the catastrophic realization of their failure. They looked at each other, then at the door, then at me. They were trapped, and they knew it. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:15, cutting through the tension in the dining room like a knife. It was a sharp, demanding sound that signalled the end of the charade. James jumped out of his skin, his eyes darting toward the hallway. Valerie half rose from her chair, clutching her napkin to her throat as if she were strangling. She looked ready to bolt, ready to run for the door and never look back. I'll get it, she stammered, her voice thin and squeaky with panic. It must be the notary. I'll just go check. Sit down, Valerie, I ordered. My voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried the weight of 40 years of boardroom authority. It was the voice that had stared down union bosses and hostile investors. It was a voice that did not allow negotiation. She froze halfway out of her seat. She looked at me, and for the first time she saw the man behind the father-in-law she had dismissed. She saw the iron beneath the cardigan. Her legs gave out, and she sank back into the chair, the silk of her robe rustling like dry leaves. She was terrified. She stayed seated. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, calm movements. I checked my cuffs. I straightened my tie. I looked at James, who was shaking his head in rhythmic denial, his face shining with a sheen of cold sweat. That is not the notary's son, I said, walking right past him toward the foyer. That's the clean-up crew. I walked to the front door, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. I threw the deadbolt. I turned the handle. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing the brilliant morning sun and the figures standing on my porch. Chloe was in the front, holding a thick leather briefcase. She looked tired but fierce, her eyes scanning me for injuries. Flanking her were two uniformed police officers, their hands resting near their belts. And behind them was a man wearing a windbreaker with yellow letters on the back. Agent Morales of the FBI. Mr. Caldwell, Agent Morales said, giving a respectful nod. We are ready when you are. Come in, gentlemen, I said, stepping aside. And Chloe? Breakfast is just wrapping up. They entered the house, a silent column of justice. I led them back to the dining room. The sound of their heavy boots on the floorboards was a drum roll of doom for the two people sitting at my table. We walked through the double doors. James and Valerie looked up. When they saw the uniforms, when they saw the FBI jacket, the air seemed to suck right out of the room. Valerie let out a small, strangled sob and covered her mouth with her hand. James turned a colour I had never seen on a living human being, a sickly, greyish white that spoke of total system shock. Chloe walked straight to the table and slammed a thick file down onto the white tablecloth, right next to the half-eaten plate of pancakes. The silverware clinked. James Caldwell, she announced, her voice ringing clear and cold. "You are under arrest." James stared at the file, then at the agents, then at me. His eyes were wild, darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a weapon, looking for anything that could change the reality collapsing on top of him. He was a trapped animal, and trapped animals bite. His hand shot out. He grabbed the silver steak knife from his placemat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle. He stumbled out of his chair, knocking it backward with a loud crash. He lunged, not at the agents, but at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. "You did this!" he screamed, raising the knife. "You ruined everything." He took 2 steps. Agent Morales moved with a speed that blurred the eye. He stepped forward, intercepting James's clumsy lunge. He grabbed James's wrist, twisting it violently until the knife clattered uselessly onto the hardwood floor. In one fluid motion, Morales spun my son around and slammed him face first into the table. There was a sickening crunch as James's nose met the fine china. His face landed squarely in the plate of Eggs Benedict I had prepared with such care an hour ago. The hollandaise splashed across the tablecloth like yellow paint. The yolk broke, staining his hair and his expensive silk robe. "Stay down," Morales barked, pressing James's face harder into the ruined breakfast. "Don't move!" James screamed, muffled sounds of rage and pain bubbling up through the food. One of the uniformed officers moved in, pulling James's arms behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut cut off the screams. I stood at the head of the table watching. I watched my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had tried to destroy me, being subdued in a puddle of egg yolk and broken ambition. I should have felt horror. I should have felt pity. But as I stared at the knife lying on the floor, the knife he had intended for me, I felt nothing but a cold, hollow satisfaction. He wanted to be the boss, I thought. He wanted the big seat. Well, he got the attention of the authorities. He got the full weight of the consequences. I picked up my coffee cup, which had remained untouched through the violence. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was still hot. I looked at Chloe and nodded. "Proceed," I said. "Let's finish this." Chloe stood like a statue of judgment amid the ruins of my dining room table. She opened the thick legal file she had thrown down and began to read, her voice cutting right through James's groans. "James Caldwell, you are hereby charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement regarding the theft of $3 million from the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. You are also charged with securities fraud for attempting to liquidate company assets without board approval and with the forgery of medical documents with the intent to declare incompetence." James tried to lift his head off the table, his cheek slick with the hollandaise he had been devouring just minutes ago. "That's a lie," he sputtered, spitting egg yolk onto the tablecloth. "My father is sick. He doesn't know what he's doing. He gave me permission." Chloe didn't even look at him. She turned a page in the file, the paper snapping crisply in the silence. "We have the digital logs from your computer, James. We have the transfer records to JC Investments. And we have the audio recording from last night where you explicitly discussed inducing a diabetic coma in your father to seize control. That brings us to the final charge. Attempted murder and aggravated elder abuse." The colour drained entirely from James's face, leaving it a pasty grey. He stopped fighting against the handcuffs. The weight of the words crushed the air right out of his lungs. He looked at me, his eyes begging for a reprieve, begging me to tell them it was all a game. But I just sipped my coffee, the bitter liquid grounding me. Then Chloe turned her attention to Valerie. My daughter-in-law sat frozen in her chair. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked small and pathetic, stripped of all her arrogance. "I didn't do anything," she sobbed, her voice high and terrified. "I didn't know about the money. I just wanted us to be happy. Please, Robert, tell them. I'm innocent." "You are many things, Valerie," I said, quietly setting down my cup. "But innocent is not one of them." Chloe reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. She didn't open it gracefully. She dumped the contents onto the table right in front of James's face. Glossy photographs slid across the white linen. They were high resolution, taken by a private investigator I had hired weeks ago when I first suspected the rot in my house. They showed Valerie, but not with James. They showed her at a cafe holding hands with a man I recognized as a local tennis instructor. They showed her walking into a hotel room. They showed her kissing him in a parked car. James stared at the photos. His brain struggled to process the visual information. The embezzlement he could justify to himself. The abuse he could rationalize. But this was a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Who is that?" "That is Jean-Luc," Chloe said coldly. "The man Valerie was planning to meet in Paris next week with your stolen money. She wasn't running away with you, James. She was running away from you." A sound ripped from James's throat, a raw animal howl of rage that made the police officers tighten their grip on his arms. He thrashed in the chair, knocking over the crystal juice pitcher. The orange juice spilled across the table, mixing with the photos, staining the evidence of her deceit. "Liar!" he screamed, lunging toward Valerie, his face purple with fury. "Traitor! I did this for you! I stole for you!" Valerie scrambled backward, her chair toppling over as she tried to get away from him. "I never loved you," she shrieked, her face twisted with fear and hate. "You're a loser, James. You always were. You couldn't even steal right." The room descended into absolute chaos. James screaming obscenities, fighting the cuffs, trying to get to his wife. Valerie crying hysterically, begging the officers to keep him away. The beautiful breakfast, the symbol of my love and my labor, was destroyed, scattered across the floor in a mess of broken glass and wasted food. "Get them out of here," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "Get them out of my house." The officers hauled James to his feet. He was sobbing now, broken completely, not by the law, but by the truth. As they dragged him toward the door, he looked back at me one last time. His eyes were red and desperate, searching for the father who used to catch him when he fell. "Dad," he managed to choke out. "Dad, please help me." I looked at him. I looked at the son I had raised, and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my love had finally dried up, drained by years of selfishness and permanently sealed by a single act of violence. I didn't see my boy. I saw a stranger who had broken into my home and tried to kill me. "You made your bed, son," I said, my voice as cold as the winter wind. "Now you have 20 years to sleep in it." I watched them drag him out the door. His screams faded into the morning air. I didn't look away. I watched until the heavy oak door slammed shut, sealing the silence back inside. I was alone in the dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of my family. but for the first time in months, the air felt clean. It has been 6 months since the sirens faded from my driveway, leaving behind a silence that finally feels like peace. I'm not sitting in the high-backed leather chair of a CEO's office. Today I'm not wearing the charcoal suit that served as my armor on the worst day of my life. Instead, I'm wearing a faded flannel shirt and a battered fishing hat that has seen better days. Sitting on the weathered bench of an aluminium boat, bobbing gently on the waters of a quiet lake. The lakefront mansion is gone. I put it on the market 3 days after James was denied bail. I couldn't walk those halls without seeing the ghost of my son standing over me with a raised hand, without smelling the metallic tang of blood in the kitchen. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene of the heart. I sold it to a nice young family who knew nothing of its history, and I took every single penny of the $4 million and donated it to the Beatrice Caldwell Scholarship Fund. The money James had been willing to kill for is now sending underprivileged kids to college. I think Beatrice would have liked that. She always said money was like manure. It's only useful if you spread it around to help things grow. The company is safe. I didn't dissolve it. There were too many good people relying on those paychecks. But I fired myself. I handed the keys to the corner office and the headaches to my VPA, a woman who has worked for me for 15 years and who truly knows the value of hard work. I kept 51% of the voting shares just in case, but I haven't set foot in the building in months. The shark has retired. He's swimming in calmer waters now. I haven't visited James. I get letters from the penitentiary occasionally. The first ones were furious, full of blame and vitriol. The recent ones are pleas, asking for commissary money, asking for a better lawyer. I don't open them. I put them in a box in the garage, unopened. Maybe someday I'll read them. Maybe someday I'll find the forgiveness to answer. But not today. Today I choose me. The sun is starting to dip below the tree line, painting the water in shades of gold and violet. I reel in my line, checking the bait. I haven't caught a thing all day, and honestly, I don't care. Fishing is just an excuse to be out here, to breathe air that doesn't smell like deceit, to listen to the wind instead of lies. I reach into my pocket and pull out my phone. It's not a new one, it's the old Nokia brick. I hold down the power button and watch the screen go black. Silence. No notifications, no emergencies, no hostile takeovers. Just the lap of the water against the hull. I open my wallet. It's worn leather, soft from years of use. Inside, nestled behind my driver's license, is a small photograph. It's old, the colours are fading, but the smile is as bright as the day it was taken. Beatrice on our honeymoon laughing at something I said, her hair blowing in the wind. I run my thumb over her face. I miss her every single day. But for the first time since she died, the grief doesn't feel like a heavy stone sitting on my chest. It feels like a companion. We did it, Beatrice, I whisper to the photo, my voice catching in my throat. I didn't let him destroy it. I didn't let him ruin your name. It was hard, Bea. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I saved the legacy. A loon calls out across the water, a sad, beautiful sound. I look up at the vast, open sky. I am 74 years old. I have no son. I have no wife. But I have my dignity. I have my honor. And for the first time in a very long time, I have my freedom. I put the wallet back in my pocket and cast my line out into the water, watching the lure splash and sink into the depths. I lean back, closing my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. The shark is sleeping. Robert is finally awake, and the view from here is perfect. This experience taught me a painful but necessary truth. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. We often confuse endurance with love, believing that as parents we must tolerate endless disrespect to keep the peace. But I learned that you cannot save someone who is determined to destroy you, even if that person is your own child. My son mistook my age for weakness and my grief for senility. He forgot that the same hands that cradled him also built an empire. Never apologize for protecting your dignity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let people face the consequences of their own actions.